Okay, that looks good. Dun, 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 dun. Okay. Ooh, that's really loud. Down we go. All right. Let me dim the lights a little bit. Ah, two. All right. Good stuff. Okay. Hello again. Apologies for the slight delay. Having some technical difficulties. One, I forgot to charge my laptop, so it's about to die. So I had to plug it in, which means interesting. After 4 months, you found your forever lost AirPod. Strange. That's very strange. I think, oh, it might not be in this bag. It's in my other laptop case, which is with my other laptop at home. I found someone's AirPod, and then I got a notification on my iPad that someone's AirPod is following me around. Um, so I'm like, I have to figure out whose AirPod that is, or someone can like geolocate their AirPod at my house, which is also weird. Okay, this is I know this is off topic, but what are your thoughts on the Canadian election? That's my thought. I have a giant sigh about this coming election. Um, Obviously, I mean, I have major reservations about everyone. Pierre Polyev is Pierre Polyev. He might be okay. I don't know. He might also be a troll. I can't quite figure it out. He's definitely spent a long time cultivating his image as snarky jerk on the internet, which I'm not super fond of. But I also, after 10 years of the liberals, I've had enough of the liberals, and I don't care if. Well, I actually read Mark Carney's book, and I have really like severe concerns about Mark Carney. So I think we're screwed. Actually, that's my thought on the Canadian election. We're screwed. It doesn't matter who you pick. We're screwed in general. Um, but it'll be fun to be the 51st state, I guess. I don't know. Okay, what the hell happened there? Okay, I see. I booted up in the wrong slide. Okay, hang on a second. Let me fix that. Okay, hang on. But no, I think we're cooked, as my kids would say. We're cooked. Like you have no good options. I'm gonna go with that. Well, no matter what you do, you're dead. Okay, good times. Ah, what was I doing? Yes, this. Okay, so obviously today we're going to keep going talking about race and ethnicity. I think we'll probably finish it today and then move into families. So we're going at a good pace. We have a few units left till the end of the course. They're all a little bit more grounded than the stuff that was at the beginning, and so we can move through stuff a little bit faster. And when we get to religion, we're probably going to take a little bit because that's like one of my pet topics and one of my favorites. So we'll probably move through that relatively slowly. Okay, so what were we talking about last time? Let's go back a step. Oh, we were talking about these conflict theories of race and ethnicity, right? And always to keep in mind with conflict theory, My shoes are squeaking. I'm going to take them off for a sec because I don't like the squeaky following me around. One thing to keep in mind with conflict theories is that they're always structured in this kind of oppressor-oppressed narrative, right? So they're always trying to work out who in any kind of dichotomy is the oppressor and the oppressed, right? And we get, so when we talk about feminism, right, men are the oppressor, women are the oppressed, the oppressive system is the patriarchy. When we talk about race, right, the way it's kind of become structured in a lot of conflict theories discourses is it's around, whiteness or white people, and then, other people. The most recent kind of terminology is like black, indigenous, and people of color. Though again, I suspect that terminology is going to change over time. So that's kind of how conflict theory sees things, always through the lens of like, you know, some kind of oppressor, white or settler colonists, and oppressed, indigenous. Like it's always structured in these kind of dichotomies between oppressor and oppressed. Okay, so we talk about race and ethnicity in Canada. Things are obviously changing quite a bit, and we have some kind of different projections on what things are going to look like. Okay, so prior to the 1960s, right, Canada's immigration policy very strongly favored people of European descent. Bless you. So it was very much focused on white people, right? And white people from Europe with, special privilege given to anyone from the British Isles, right? That was like number one. And then, people from other parts of Europe, France, Germany, Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, as well, were kind of welcome. Spain, Portugal, all that fun stuff. Now, and they discouraged immigration from other places, right? And historically, the Canadian government really strongly opposed immigration from places like Japan and China for a bunch of, racial and ethnic reasons. Now, this was, and probably just straight up racism, this policy officially changes in the 1960s, right? Immigration policy is liberalized and changed, and basically the racial and ethnic restrictions are removed. Now, this could, if you're optimistic, you could take this as a sign that Canada was becoming a more progressive place, a less racist place, and all of that stuff. I've always tended to read this shift as a little bit differently. Um, what happens, in by the time we kind of hit the 1960s and 70s, is European immigration has slowed down massively, right? People are not coming from Europe nearly as often, simply because Europe has, for one thing, European birth rates are starting to come down, and Europe has really rebuilt after the Second World War and is experiencing a kind of prolonged period of prosperity. Okay, I'll say in the West, right? Now, the central and eastern part of Europe are still pretty poor, and quite likely lots of people would have wanted to come over from Central and Eastern Europe, but there was this thing that's kind of colloquially referred to as the Iron Curtain, right? And that was basically, in this period, Central and Eastern Europe was largely controlled by the Soviet Union. The communists, the Russians, all that, whatever you want to say. And so essentially, they limited emigration from the USSR and its communist satellite states pretty severely, which meant that lots of people who probably would have wanted to come to Canada from Central and Eastern Europe were blocked from doing so. Now, Canada has always depended on immigration to kind of boost its population, or more recently to sort of keep its population from declining. And suddenly, there's not enough European immigration, so all of a sudden they discover, that racial and ethnic kind of quotas probably don't matter anymore, and they, take all of those barriers down, and we start to see more immigration from more places. Now, this is always phrases like multiculturalism or Canada, diversity is our strength. I've always tended to think it's much more cynical than that. It was like, well, we need people, and the people we prefer aren't coming anymore. So, okay, we'll take anyone at this point. And I think this is what historically happened. But again, I'm a cynic. at heart, and I always have been. So I tend to see bad motives in things where maybe there aren't any. Okay, what happens, basically from the period of the 1960s until really about 2015, what happened in 2015? Well, look it up. It appears in blackface occasionally. That's all I'll say. Um, Basically, Canadian immigration policy is structured in such a way as to prioritize immigration based on potential economic contribution to the country. So the immigration system is highly selective and brings in only the most kind of upper classes of most of the places that they are coming from. But it does have the effect on Canada of becoming much more racially and ethnically diverse. Okay, so, right, what happens in 2015? That's the second Trudeau government. Trudeau Jr. Okay, well, we'll try to forget about him now that he's gone, if we can. Not a fan of his either. Not a fan of anyone, actually. Okay, here's my life advice. Never be a fan of politicians. They're all terrible. They come in brand of terrible and extremely terrible. So never align your heart with a politician, right? So, to hell with Trump, to hell with Polyev, to hell with Mark Carney. Let's just build a anarchist, communist anarchist utopia. I don't know. That's what I got. What's it Diderot said? The man will only be free when the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. I've sometimes thought that sounds like a fun weekend project. I don't know. So I don't like politicians. All right. So anyway, I have friends who are priests. They probably wouldn't appreciate that if I said that. Okay. What was I talking about? Okay, yeah. So Canada's become more ethnically diverse, and we can see kind of the shifts in where people come from, right? This is the 2006 numbers. Whoa, back, versus 2031. So the 2031, obviously we're not there yet. This is the projections. And you see basically, right, all of these numbers pretty much increasing. So we see more people come from more different places, and their percentages of the population are going to increase, right? And what's going to happen is, and this has already been happening, kind of people of European descent as a portion of the population is declining, and we're becoming much more ethnically and racially diverse. And if we look at our big cities, right, that's Toronto. Oh, what's the code? I think it's YVC for Vancouver. Toronto and Vancouver, right, are already majority minority cities, right, where there is no clear majority. They're really, really deeply ethnically mixed. Okay. And yeah, even though people are coming from all over the world, in the last 10 years, the dominant kind of trend is people coming from India, China, and the Philippines. That's where most people have come from. And we've seen, since 2015, the growth has really been from these two places. A lot of this has been driven by temporary foreign workers, and then people that then turn that into permanent residency. But that is a story for a completely different course, not this one. Okay, so how does conflict theory, see some of these questions around immigration? Well, one of the concerns that comes out of conflict theory is that when you get people coming, especially low wage workers from another part of the world, you create what's called the split labor market, right? Where basically low wage workers of one race and high wage workers from another compete for the same jobs. And then those high wage workers are likely to resent the presence of the low wage competition. Now, historically in Canada, this has happened, right? Like if we look back, kind of towards the founding of the country, right? Back in the middle part of the 19th century, 1867, one of the kind of goals of the Canadian government, obviously, was to build the Canadian Pacific Railroad, right? So basically they started building it from both ends of the country. And they didn't have enough workers in British Columbia, like on the BC side, to build it. So they imported a lot of workers from China, right? From Asia, but specifically from China. Okay, so what did that look like? Basically, you had a mix of people of different races, white and Chinese, building the Canadian Pacific Railroad. And Chinese workers, right, got paid less. I'll write that down. Chinese workers got paid considerably less than their white counterparts. And so the construction companies often favored hiring a lot of Chinese workers, right? Because they were getting paid to lay track by the mile. And if you can pay, Chinese workers way less, you can lay a lot more track at less of an expense. White workers there um, tended to object to this because they were like, those, people are taking our jobs, right? Those jobs would be going to us and we'd be getting paid higher wages, but they're undercutting us because of their racial status. Now, we still see this today. Actually, I'm going to talk about temporary foreign workers. Never mind. Why would I do this? Oh, why would I do this to myself? I don't know. Just because I hate myself. All right, so we have today in Canada this category of temporary foreign workers, right? Now, typically temporary foreign workers, they'll work in industries like, I guess where we've seen them, fast food, retail, childcare, in kind of childcare centers, or as nannies and agriculture. Now, one of the things we've started to see in Canada, since 2015, we've brought in massive numbers of temporary foreign workers, right? Somewhere between 2 and 4 million people as temporary foreign workers. And one of the complaints that started to kind of form around this is that temporary foreign workers have created, and you kind of hear this, like as we go into this next election, pay attention to this discourse because it's absolutely there. Oh, this was in the news just yesterday. The federal government, the Liberals, they basically have granted legal status to a bunch of construction workers, like people in construction industries, that came into Canada illegally. And the kind of association that represents Canada's construction trades lodged an objection to this, saying what? That these, kind of people who had come illegally, sometimes as temporary foreign workers would then overstayed their visas, were basically leading to lower wages because they're willing to accept getting paid less than someone who is kind of born in Canada, right? And you get the same thing happening, in kind of retail, in fast food, in all of these trades. These companies bring in temporary foreign workers on the premise that there's no Canadians that will do these jobs, always with the at the prices we're willing to pay, right? Which is generally not much. And so they're like, we have to bring in a temporary foreign worker, or you won't be able to get your Starbucks. Well, not even Starbucks. Starbucks is less bad for this. Tim Hortons. Let's say you're Tim Hortons. Why anyone would want to get anything from Tim Hortons, I have no idea. Unless you want a heart attack and a coffee that tastes like it's been in the pot for 6 years. But I'm not a big Tim Hortons fan. I'm the worst Canadian. I don't know. Who knows? It's not even a Canadian company anymore. It's owned from Brazil. So I'm going to go with that. What am I even talking about? Right. These companies, sorry, I get lost in my own rants. So these companies have brought people in, and they're paying the minimum wage, because they're like, well, no Canadians will work for minimum wage at our retail outlets. And the general, kind of reply to that is, well, pay people better, right? If you pay people better, then, you'll be able to find Canadian workers. We won't have to import people. So this is what we call a split labor market, right? You basically have this group of people who are, in this case, racially, ethnically diverse, right? They're immigrants. They're being brought in, working for low wages compared to what Canadians would be willing to accept as wages, right? So they are more than willing to work in those conditions. By the way, if you want an argument against the TFWs or the TFW program, there was a United Nations envoy who came to Canada, looked at the program, and said that it was a breeding ground for modern day forms of slavery. So, not good. Canada shouldn't have modern day forms of slavery. But this is the idea of the split labor market, right? And what happens is it creates resentment. And okay, so you could go on Twitter, X, or whatever it's called now. Probably not a good idea in general because it's a hive of scum and villainy and Russian and Chinese bots. Um, but one of the things that I've seen in my Twitter feed, because I troll the internet's dark places, is a lot of this kind of discourse. It's like, hey, we're importing TFWs, they're taking Canadian jobs, right? We should not do that anymore. And they'll target specific ethnicities, right? A lot of them are from India, right? From especially the Punjab region in India, and they're like, this is a Punjabi takeover, right? You see this on X all the time. Creates these racist attitudes based on kind of split labor markets, right? They're willing to work for less than we are. They're taking our jobs. They're suppressing our wages. And so we hate them as a kind of group. You see quite a bit of that. And it's not without sort of grounding in reality to some sense, right? Definitely, if we didn't have the TFW program, I guarantee you, because it's happened in the past, McDonald's, Starbucks, Tim Hortons would be paying more than they currently are. Okay, what about roll up the rim? Okay, I've never won a vehicle in roll up the rim, and I'm still salty about this. I've won like a free coffee, a donut, and I'm like, I want the van. Actually, the van this year looks really dumb, but um, so there's a lot of argument about the temporary foreign worker program, right? Um, on the one side, yes, what you're saying, it's like it brings over a lot of people. Now, on the other hand, one of the complaints about the temporary foreign worker program is it's brought in a lot of people that are really low skilled workers, right? So they're actual, okay, this is kind of wonky economicsy stuff. When you bring in low skilled workers, they tend to actually take more out of the economy in terms of social services than they contribute in terms of taxes, right? Especially once they start bringing in, and this is a very, sorry, you're getting me into like the political science part, which I don't like, but when they start to bring in children, when they start to bring in elderly relatives like their parents, right, who then put burdens then on the education system and the healthcare system, there's a really strong argument to be made that temporary foreign workers, especially low skilled ones, actually cost the system more than it generates. And who does it generate kind of benefits for is mostly corporations like Tim Hortons and Canadian Tire that hires them. Minimum wages for those jobs. Um, okay, so it does make it easier for people to come over and to get things like permanent residency, but there's a pretty strong economics argument that it actually puts a really strong burden. And it also kind of fills up the bottom tier of the economy so that, say, if you're a teenager or a university student, it's harder to find a job in those places where people used to find jobs. And there's pretty good evidence on this as well. Isn't there a minimum wage for those jobs, though? Um, sorry, let me finish answering this question. Canada has typically privileged higher skill workers because the idea is that these higher skill workers tend to bring more economic contribution. So yes, they get their permanent residency and then their citizenship, and they contribute a ton. Low skilled workers is a different kind of question. They don't offer quite as much, and they often soak up more in services than they actually contribute economically in terms of taxes. So that is the kind of argument. Is there a minimum wage for those jobs? Sort of. Can I? This is what one of those reasons why it was called. I can't remember. Okabatu, I think is the name of the person from the UN. Why they said it was a breeding ground for forms of modern day slavery. So what happens in the temporary foreign worker program? Oh, now you've gotten me into like really wonky shit. This is why, yeah, you don't want to ask this question. But you did, so it's too late for you now. Okay, so what happens when you want to if you're a company that wants to get a temporary foreign worker brought in, you have to fill out a form or called a labor market impact assessment that says that you, as a company, have posted this job and you can't find anybody to fill it locally, so you'd like to bring in a temporary foreign worker. Now, what's happened with labor market impact assessments is they're rife with fraud, right? These companies will post it like on a hidden part of their website, being like, we're looking for people. And nobody applies. So they're like, oh, nobody wants the job. We need to bring in a temporary foreign worker. What they've done, though, is they've sold those labor market impact assessments to immigration consultants in places like the Philippines and India. And then people come and they're like, I want to move to Canada. I need you to get me a job through this labor market impact assessment system. The immigration lawyers or the immigration consultants in these countries are charging them somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 basically to get them a job working at Tim Hortons. Okay, so that's not important. Okay, so that's part one, right? So they're paying to come over. Once you come over as a temporary foreign worker, you are tied to your employer, right? So it's not like you can come over and they're treating you like garbage at Canadian Tire and you can then just quit. You are stuck there. And if you quit that job, you get deported, right? Or you're here illegally, your visa gets revoked. So a lot of the employers that bring them in have these they really mistreat them. They pay them sometimes under minimum wage, even though it's illegal. The other things that a lot of people have been caught doing is say you run a McDonald's. This question is not, anyway, I'll answer that in a second. You run a McDonald's, right? You have a franchise of a McDonald's, but you also own a bunch of housing, right? You bought a bunch of condos or some houses. Well, you bring in your temporary foreign workers, and as a condition of them working at your McDonald's and being able to send wages home and maybe apply for PR or permanent residency eventually, you have them live in a house that you own. You stack them in there like cordwood, sometimes 10, 15 people to a house, right? So they sleep in shifts as they go. One person will sleep in the bed while the other person goes to work at the McDonald's and they switch. And then what do? You claw back $700 a month from each of them in terms of rent, right? So technically you're paying minimum wage, but you're clawing a bunch of that back in terms of rent, and they can't often get out of those arrangements because if they do, let's say like, I'm leaving, I'm going to find a cheaper place to rent. You're like, okay, well, you're fired, and then they get shipped back to wherever they came from. And then if you get shipped back after you kind of lost your job, you're barred from entering Canada for 10 years. So you can't apply for another labor market impact assessment or PR or temporary foreign worker job. Anyway, so that's the really wonky answer to that question. It's way too long, but this is a kind of, I don't know, topic that I'm interested in because I'm also teaching a class on labor. So it is technically, yes, there's a minimum wage, but there's a lot of ways that gets clawed back. And it's a really crappy system, and a lot of people get exploited really badly in it. And it needs to be reformed, probably not abolished, but reformed. Okay. Hearing that an Uber driver of mine had a master's degree I'm studying for, change your thoughts. Why are some degrees valid? Would that help money-wise? I do not know. Why aren't some degrees valid? Okay, so I'm assuming this Uber driver was coming from a different place in the world. And there's just a lot of times that qualifications from other places aren't recognized, right? That happens really regularly. I have friends who moved here from Colombia. I have friends who moved here from Russia. My one friend who moved here from Russia, so she married a friend of mine who had been over there doing consulting. She was a pediatric surgeon in Russia. She moved here, could not get her certifications recognized, so she had to retrain as a pediatric nurse, right? And she's still a pediatric nurse. She's one of the smartest people I know. She's constantly schooling, according to her. I mean, she's Russian, so she's kind of dramatic anyway. But she's constantly schooling a lot of the the doctors she works with, especially the residents, because she knows more than they do, but she's never been able to get her Russian qualifications recognized. Okay, let me clear some questions here. So yeah, sometimes it's, if you do it here, likely it'll be recognized. Okay. A lot of skilled workers can't get jobs here, like docs from India, even though their skills are valid. They can't get those certifications, right? Because a medical degree there is not recognized by the dreaded Alberta Medical Association or another Canadian body. And without that, you can't be a doctor here. Okay. Will the final be the same structure as the midterms, like online? Yes, everything is the same. Okay. Holy mazzoli, that took a while. What time is it? All right, cool. That took longer than I thought. Okay, so when we talk about our split labor markets, right, generally speaking, those who were more likely to suffer from it historically were those that had trouble assimilating into British values, right? Our Chinese workers at the beginning of or in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Um, those British values that dominate Canadian society. And they were also often subject to things like expulsion from their native lands, conquest, slavery, and all sorts of things, right? Indigenous people also suffered from this, right? Indigenous people also were often kind of targeted for lowering the wages of white workers and being unfair competition in the labor market. So all sorts of crazy stuff happens. Okay, yeah, left. Anyway, I won't read that point. All right, so let's talk about some advantages of ethnicity, though. We've talked about a lot of disadvantages, a lot of potential problems that might be caused by ethnicity. There are some, and here we're into kind of a functionalist school of thinking. Sorry, after my mini lecture on temporary foreign workers and labor market impact assessments. Let's get back to race and ethnicity. Okay. Oh. So, what's useful about ethnicity, right? So why, if ethnicity, in the conflict theory and to some extent in our symbolic interactionist kind of versions, if it's so problematic, why do people still use it? Well, why do people still cling to ethnic identities even generations after maybe their ancestors left country of origin? So there are, things that membership in ethnic communities do that can help explain why they continue to be an active part of Canadian society, right? Okay. So this is for some white European Canadians. So I think this is increasingly true for people from all over the world. The one that I always think about in terms of these advantages for me is always Ukrainian Canadians, right? Ukrainian Canadians have these kinds of things that you can look at. Okay, so there are certain economic advantages, right? Okay, so think of here, this is less, I said Ukrainians, but I'll come back to Ukrainians in a second. Economic advantages. So one of the things that typically ethnic identity has been useful for is kind of clustering together, helping each other out, creating institutions of support economically. And you can think of, like Chinese people in Canada, would have clustered together in Chinatown, created their own financial institutions to provide loans to each other. Italians did much the same thing, which is why you still see kind of in some Canadian and American cities, areas that are Chinatown or Little Italy or whatever it happens to be, right? There are economic advantages to ethnic identity. People can help each other. And sometimes they form, actual institutions to provide loans and assistance to each other and other sorts of support. That's one. Okay, so we come to our Ukrainians. Political usefulness. So, if you have a cohesive ethnic community, right, you can get a lot of stuff from governments, especially in democratic countries. Why? Well, because you can present a potentially powerful voting bloc. And this has been true of Ukrainian Canadians in Canada for a really long time, right? In the kind of early part of the 20th century, right, especially after the First World War, we had a big wave of Ukrainian immigration in that period, kind of around the collapse of the Russian Empire and before the Soviets really clamped back down on Ukraine. You had a big wave of Ukrainian immigration. Then you had another smaller wave after the Second World War. This has meant that people who continue to identify as Ukrainian Canadian have a pretty large and fairly cohesive kind of voting bloc, right? And Ukrainian Canadians have used this very effectively to get a whole bunch of stuff, right? They've gotten certain policies, passed, a lot of government support for Ukrainian Canadian institutions, churches and cultural centers, and all sorts of things. It gets lots of funding from the Canadian government, And then once Ukraine became independent of the Soviet Union, a lot of close tie building between Ukraine and Canada, right? Building those kind of links both ways. So having this really cohesive ethnic identity can allow you to lobby governments for stuff, right? For stuff and for policies that you happen to like. Okay, and obviously it also helps to provide emotional support, right? People that get you, people that have a similar heritage to you, it's all kind of supported. So ethnicity, if we want to talk in functionalist terms, has a function, right? It continues to be a functional category for a lot of people, which is why it persists. If ethnicity was no longer useful, highly likely people would stop identifying along kind of ethnic lines. And we certainly see that, I think with ethnicities that aren't as cohesive, they break down pretty quickly and people stop identifying that way. Okay. Oh, I had these on other slides. Okay. I'm bad at my job. I forgot that I had all of these on another slide. I won't repeat this because obviously we just said it. Okay. All right. So if we want to talk about, and I think I have a couple of slides, like 3 slides left. Okay. So we want to talk kind of race and ethnicity on a spectrum, right? Of intolerance to tolerance, right? We can talk about it, and this one always gets people because it seems intolerant, but actually it's on this spectrum, it's extremely tolerant. So obviously, we kind of move in different kind of paces. At the extreme end of intolerance, right, you have genocide. There's so much intolerance towards a group of people that you have to exterminate them entirely from the earth, right? Their very existence is offensive to you, right? That is at the extreme end of intolerance. Slightly less intolerant is expulsion, right? Okay, you can, I think of here, Donald Trump's sort of position on Gaza, right? It's like, okay, you can exist, but somewhere else, right? We don't want you here, right? So it's slightly more tolerant, like we don't want to wipe you off the face of the earth. You can continue to exist, just not here, right? And this is obviously, it was done to a lot of indigenous people in Canada and the US. It's like, great, it's so lovely that you're here. Go exist over on that reserve, just away from us, right? Slavery, on this scale, slightly more tolerant. Like, we will, I was going to say hang out, but that's wrong. We will allow you to be in our presence as long as you serve us, as slaves. Segregation is like, okay, you don't have to serve us as slaves anymore, but we can't mix, right? These two groups can't mix. And then pluralism, right, which we would probably think of as the most tolerant, but here it's number 5. You can you can keep your characteristics. We can intermix, right? We can combine and recombine and kind of mix with each other freely, but you should keep your traditions and we'll keep our traditions and it's all good. And then the most tolerant, according to this kind of sliding scale of tolerance, is assimilation, where basically everyone blends together. Everybody becomes a single culture, so everybody kind of, all the differences sort of disappear. So yeah, that one is listed as the most tolerant, which I think is an interesting kind of way of thinking of it. Assimilation is at the, we'll make everyone the same and then everyone will get along perfectly well. Excuse me. Okay, so last kind of topic for race, and then we'll move to families for the rest of the class. And I have it pulled up on my computer already. CRT, or critical race theory. So what is CRT? So CRT it's a conflict theory, right? So it comes out of conflict theory, definitely. It was developed okay, so it comes out of law schools, right? So it comes out of law schools. Specifically, it comes out of Harvard Law. And it comes from a scholar named Daniel Bell. And these kind of race-conscious legal scholars at Harvard developed critical race theory basically with the following idea, right? That race continues to be important, especially in American society, and that much of the power that race has is based on these kinds of, common practices. embedded in political, legal, and other institutions. But positions that are people might not be aware of, right? So essentially, the way critical race theory often thinks of it. Here, I'll clear this off. And I'm doing this as a sketch. Anytime you see inequality along racial lines, right, that must be the result of some kind of structure, some kind of structural difference built into society that is keeping equality from kind of manifesting, right? So different educational outcomes has to be because of um, some kind of structural factor, right? If there's fewer black students getting into Harvard University, there must be some kind of bias in, and this is the argument that's been made, things like the SAT, right? That the SAT standardized testing is biased, and therefore it keeps black students from getting into Harvard University, right? Or admissions, right? The admissions office is somehow racist or has racialized characteristics, so it keeps people from getting in, right? So any kind of inequality along racial lines has structural elements. The remedy to this, typically in critical race theory, and you see this in people like Abraham X. Kendi, is, Kendi puts it, I think he's the most sort of straightforward about it. The remedy for past inequality is, or past discrimination is future discrimination, but reversed, right? So you reverse the patterns of discrimination. Okay, now critical race theory, okay, how does it kind of think about something like education, right? So, and to show like the structural kind of barriers that people face. The education system, like if you think of education, at least the way we typically think of it is that it's based on merit, right? The students with the best grades, right, the A plus students, are going to get into the best programs, the best universities, and have the most opportunity based on their merit, right? Because they're the best students. What critical race theorists have said is if you look at education, right, a lot of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, in here they're thinking mostly, African American, but it could be any or probably indigenous as well. Any disadvantaged background can't compete on an equal footing, right? And I think where it's often put is they don't start from the same place. They start with disadvantages, right? They're not as wealthy, so if they're having trouble in math, maybe a student from a higher socioeconomic status can afford tutoring, right? Their parents will get them tutoring. So that kid immediately has a sort of advantage, right? So, because they don't start with the same, like not everybody starts on an even playing field. So what critical race theory will tend to say, merit might sound fair, right? Best students get into the best schools. That sounds fair, right? They get the most advantages. That sounds fair. But what they say is this actually sort of entrenches subtle forms of racism, right? Where it continues to perpetuate certain classes as advantaged, right? They have the advantage, and because they are always ahead, they always keep that advantage, right? And so critical race theorists, will propose new programs to say improve students from disadvantaged backgrounds so that they start on a more even playing field. And you'll hear this if you listen to US discourses. One of the ones they always talk about is universal pre-K. So universal pre-kindergarten, right? So from age 3, everybody would have access to pre-kindergarten, like basically preschool programs, right? So that kids could be in these institutional settings and get those advantages of preschool that more wealthy people can more easily afford, right? Okay. And yeah, things like if you're going to address the problems of disadvantaged communities, you have to listen to those communities. You can't impose them solutions from the top down. And this, basically critical race theory is often aimed at sort of showing subtly how systems are attuned against minorities and how neutral policy frames like merit, colorblindness, equity, opportunity actually reproduce privilege. Now, This system is not without its. This system of thinking has become very popular. It's not without its flaws either. For instance, one of the things that critical race theory has sort of had to twist itself into knots about is so why Asian students, right, who are not white, so Asian and Southeast Asian students, right, so people from East Asia and places like India, especially, have actually, like, if we look at U.S. society, they have the highest rates of admission to Ivy League schools like Princeton, Harvard, Yale, all those fancy schools everybody wants to get into, and they have higher mean incomes than any other group in society, right? So it's like, okay, if Asians, they're not white and a privilege is given to white people, how did Asians happen to achieve their higher socioeconomic status and higher rates of entry into Ivy League schools? So they've done things like talk about Asians as model minorities, right? How did they get to be so successful? They copied white people. So this ideology or this system of thought is also not without its flaws. It has certain problems built into it as well that it's had difficulties addressing. It's become a very popular school of thought, but again, not without its problems. Okay. Well, again, the scale is not without its flaws, right? Which is why I said people often find this a kind of tough thing to swallow, right? And I think the idea is people will gradually all come to resemble each other, right? We'll all kind of eventually have the same culture. It'll be like Star Trek, right? There's no religion. I'm sure you've all watched Star Trek, right? Because you're all nerds like me. Okay, why don't we leave race and ethnicity behind here, and we'll move to families. How much time do I have left? 30 minutes? Not too bad. Okay, where's my family slideshow? It's right here. Now, will it pop back up or do I have to reshare it? Okay, good times. All right, so we're shifting again to one of our kind of later units in the course. So I think after this, well, if I recall, we have religion and maybe mass media left. We'll see. I guess if we have extra time, I'll dig deep in my archive and pull up another unit, and it'll be fun. But was that a no? Don't do it. We'll see. I'll try to. Maybe I'll slow down. I'll slow down. We'll go nice and slow. Okay. And then, oh, not a no. Okay. Okay. Whoever said this, you just failed the course. Present yourself. I'm going to offer a very brief opinion. Star Wars has exactly two good movies. Star Wars, what's sometimes referred to as A New Hope, but it's just Star Wars, and The Empire Strikes Back. Every other movie in the Star Wars universe is a commercial for toys, right? Particularly Return of the Jedi. It's like, oh, we need to sell more toys. Let's make little teddy bears. Freaking Ewoks. Okay, so Star Wars has two good movies. The rest of it is trash. Star Trek also has a lot of trash, but Star Trek is much better. This will be a test question, by the way. I'm going to make this a multiple choice question that everyone gets. Which is better, Star Trek or Star Wars? And if you pick Star Wars, you lose a mark. That's my promise to you. Ooh, do I think the removal of DEI for university admissions is hardful or now making admissions more fair? That's a fraught question. Okay, let me answer this first one first. Would the final be similar to what we got on the midterms? Yes, it'll just be on the last units. So it'll probably be race, ethnicity, families, religion, and mass media. But it'll be the same, like 50 multiple choice. You have a little bit longer to do it, and all that. Revenge of the Sith is goated. Okay, seriously, having the high ground is not an advantage in a sword fight. I'm sorry, that's dumb. Anyone who knows anything about sword fighting will tell you that's not how sword fighting works. Being slightly higher on a hill doesn't mean you win. That's stupid. What's that? Yes, I used to fence recreationally, right? Yes, it's dumb though, right? You're actually at more risk because you're defending downward as someone slashes at your legs. it's actually a slight disadvantage at times to be up on a hill, especially in a one-on-one situation. In military, kind of in generally military terms, being up on a hill is good because you can shoot down at people. If you have a spear, absolutely, that's great because you can poke someone from far away. Okay, that's last education is Eunice education, not media. And a sword fight being downhill is actually somewhat advantageous. Anyway, this is dumb. He had the high ground. He's like, I win, I have the high ground. This is stupid because George Lucas is stupid. Sorry. Anyway. It's actually it's a decent movie. And frankly, I'll say this, the first one, The Phantom Menace, has probably one of the great kind of sword fights in movie history in that fight between Maul and Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn. That's a great fight and the music is fantastic. I will say Star Wars has great music. But Revenge of the Sith is dumb, guys. That's all I'm going to say. You can hate me if you want. But I think we can all agree that J.J. Abrams ruined both Star Trek and Star Wars. I think we can all agree to that. Yeah, he's bad. Okay. Okay, now I have to answer questions. Sorry, I got that mixed up. Sometimes I do mass media, sometimes I don't. I guess it's education. Maybe I'll add mass media if we run out of time. Okay. I think the removal of DI and unity admissions is harmful. We're now making admissions more fair. Okay, so there's kind of two ways to think about this, and maybe I'll take the middle road, so that everyone hates me. There were certainly things that were unfair about equity models, especially Asian students, like at places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, were getting massively disadvantaged by these models because their scores were so high, and people were starting to value things like, you know, hard life conditions that people wrote about in their admission essays. And it's like, okay, that's kind of unfair, right? These students, from an academic perspective, are clearly superior and they weren't getting in. They actually sued Harvard and won over this. So I think in some ways, that actually has made stuff more fair. But definitely, it's hard for people. Oh, sorry. There's another case to be made that in some ways, like when students that had lower testing scores were let into top universities, they actually did worse and had higher dropout rates than if they had gone to more kind of mid-rated universities. Like letting a mid-grade student into MIT is a nightmare, right? Because that school is so elite. So in some ways, you're actually harming people on both ends. That said, definitely there have been racial patterns, which are now kind of, and DEI was meant to address that, but how well it worked, I think, is another question. I'm just going to add an extra unit on why Star Trek is better than Star Wars. It's going to be the extra unit. I have slides. No, I don't actually, but I can make them. Okay. I just really like Star Trek. Star Wars isn't bad. I just got mad. I'm sorry. Star Wars is okay. What about circumstances of group based on previous actions of others? For instance, people in India are poor because of the pillaging by the British. How to fix it? Thank you. I have pop culture takes. I'm sorry. Like I'm a big pop culture guy. Okay, this is in economics history a somewhat debatable claim. But I don't want to get into this because I don't know how to address it. The claim, anyway, it's a bit of a debatable claim from an economics perspective. I know the historian that claims this. I can't remember the name. He's a super Marxist historian that claims that like India was the kind of generator of the bulk of global GDP until the British went in and pillaged it. I think there's problems with that, but maybe that's a conversation we can have in private. Come to my office hours so that I don't like derail the entire class on another wonkish economics kind of side talk. Okay. Oh, families. Are we back to families? Okay. Okay. So we talked about family. Okay, let's talk functionalism, right? We barely talked about functionalism as race and ethnicity. So let's talk about functionalism in terms of when we talk about families. Okay, so functionalism, right? If we recall from our schools of thought, Functionalism has very particular way. I think I wasted 10 minutes talking about Star Wars. I'm sorry. Um, Functionalism has a very particular ways of looking at institutions, right? So again, always think of functionalism as thinking about what institutions do and whether they're working well or not, right? So when functionalists think of families, right, how families work and what makes, certain families work, function and help raise people, children, they tend to think about a couple of things. The most typical form of family that we've had since the Middle Ages, um, which is the nuclear family, right? So nuclear family, right, is typically parents and children. The children are biologically related to both parents. That's your typical nuclear family, right? And the basis of nuclear family has long been marriage, right? Mom, dad get married, at least historically, right? Mom, dad get married. They have kids. Those kids are raised by in a two-parent household that's separate from other kind of households, right? So and this whole idea is, to create a nuclear family, both adults move out of their parents' homes and form a new household. That's your nuclear family, right? So that's the basis of most nuclear families is marriage, right? It has been historically. And what is marriage? It's a socially approved, right? So it's important. It's socially approved, presumably long term, usually, sexual and economic union between a man and a woman historically, right? Now we have same sex marriage and everything's fine. That involves reciprocal rights. So rights, obligations between spouses and between parents and children, right? So both people have kind of claim on each other's, say, resources. So anything that you earned in terms of money after you got married to someone, they are owed half of it if you happen to end that relationship. And any children, that come out of that relationship, you have to take care of. Both parents are expected to take care of. Okay. Now that said, we do have other forms of families um, that can exist, right, outside of the nuclear family. So a couple of really common forms are polygamy. I'll talk about polyandry in a second. But so polygamy is like one man plus multiple women. And, polyandry is one woman with multiple men, right? So multiple men. Okay, so both of these systems exist. Um, Polygamy is relatively common. Polyandry exists in only 0.3% of human civilizations. It's incredibly rare. I think the only place we find it actively practiced today is parts of the Tibetan plateau. It's an incredibly rare kind of system. So not very common. Polygamy, much more common, one dude with lots of women. So both of these systems, right, basically expand the nuclear family horizontally, right? So horizontally by adding typically more spouses, but most often more women to a household, right? And this is like I don't know, for a while the media was obsessed with making series about, Mormons with sister wives, right? So, one man, multiple female spouses, and, they would share a husband, and the man gets, multiple women to be with. Okay. So I don't know why I feel that's awkward to talk about. Okay. That's, again, in Western societies, this is relatively uncommon. One of the features of both Judaism and Christianity is that both of these religious systems basically banned polygamy a long time ago. And so Europe, for most of its kind of Christian history, the last 2,000 years or so, has fundamentally been um, monogamous, right? So one man, one woman is the kind of basis, and polygamy was not very common. Other societies, right, in different parts of the world, it's different kinds of stories. But we don't see it very often here because we live kind of in the aftermath of a Christian civilization, right? Okay. Extended families, right, expand our nuclear family vertically by adding other generations, right? So in a single household, right? So if, and this is actually, we see this a lot, especially in immigrant communities in Canada. You have grandpa maybe living with you, mom, dad, children, sometimes aunts and uncles, right? Some members of extended family in that way, aunts and uncles, and these types of things, all living in a single household. So you add, members of another generation. Um, for instance, spouses, parents, or brothers and sisters to the household, and that's what you call an extended family. Okay. So the nuclear family, in some ways, seems to be a bit of a historical aberration. It really, appears as kind of the basic family form, probably sometime maybe the 17th or 18th century, as the kind of normative form of kind of families. And we're kind of seeing the nuclear family in a lot of ways disappear in our own society. So we have a couple of things happening, right? Decrease in marriage rates. We've seen this really kind of happening since the 1980s. We've seen marriage rates in Canada, the US, and all across Western Europe and the developed parts of Asia, so like South Korea, Japan, declining pretty much every year since the 1970s. Fewer people are getting married. And the number of people having children is going way down. I mean, a slow rise in divorce rates, right? It really jumps kind of in the 1980s when we get a change in the law that creates what's called no-fault divorce. Um, but divorce, is a consistent feature of life really since the 1960s, and it continues to be pretty normal. I have two friends going through divorces right now. It's a really sucky process. Don't get divorced. It's bad. It's not a lot of fun. My one friend's ex is being very mean about it. Um, so it should be fun to see how that turns out. Okay. So we've seen a slow rise in divorce, and we've seen a decline in what is referred to as the total fertility rate. And TFR, so this is one of my favorite measures. I don't know, I love talking about TFR. TFR is the average number of children that would be born to a woman over her lifetime if she had the same number of children as women in in each age cohort in a given year. Okay, so what does that mean? Basically, the total fertility is the number of children that we would expect women to have in their kind of what we would call the fertile range, which, depending on who you ask, is either between 15 and 44 or 15 and 49. But basically, your childbearing years, right? So this has been dropped. So, okay, I should tell you the whole story. Should I tell you the whole story? I'll tell you the whole story. What's that? Okay, I'll tell you the whole story. Not the story that people sometimes want to tell you, but the whole story. So, total fertility in Canada has been dropping since about 1860, right? 1860, you're sitting at a total fertility somewhere around 5.7 children per woman. Um, and it's been dropping, and it has a brief rebound. A brief rebound. So by the time we reach 1900, right, it was somewhere around 2.7 children per woman. It has a brief rebound between the years 1945 and 1962, where it rises to 3.8 children per woman. This is a cultural and historical moment that's referred to, and we talked about this earlier in the course. I'll tell you, what is it referred to as? The baby boom. But then we hit 1962, and the total fertility rate starts dropping slowly. In 1972, hang on, let me look, 1972, TFR in Canada falls below 2.1. So what is 2.1? 2.1 is what's referred to as replacement fertility. So basically, for a population to stay stable, the average woman in the kind of fertile range has to have 2.1 children. And it's a weird measure. So obviously some are going to have more, some are going to have less. So there's two reasons. A, you have a small amount of mortality. Some children die. And slightly more males are born than females, typically. Because nature has figured out something. Male children are much more likely to die. Much more likely to die than female children, because male children are more likely to do stupid things like ride their bike off a cliff, or some such thing. If you've known any young boys, you realize that they're incredibly risk tolerant and they do dumb stuff, and so they're much more likely to die. So you need 2.1 A, because male children are going to slightly outnumber female children. A few more male children are going to die, but also male children can't have babies. So you need a slightly higher than 2, like straight 2.0 replacement to actually get a replacement fertility. Canada's fell below 2.1 in 1972. Canada's current total fertility rate is 1.26, which is well below replacement. And I did math. I did this a couple days ago because in one of my other classes we were talking about this. In order for Canada to get back to replacement fertility, so basically just to keep our population from shrinking, today 55% of Gen Z women would have to have 3 or more children. So that's not going to happen for lots of reasons, but I did the math. It was kind of interesting. I used a naive model, so it's not quite exactly right. It's probably a little bit lower than this. But I was, when you're modeling stuff, it's a little weird. But yeah, somewhere in the range of about 55% of, to get total replacement fertility in Canada, 55% of Gen Z women would have to have 3 or more children. If some of them would have 4 or more children, you could bring that down to 37%. 37% of Gen Z women would have to have 4 or more children. So again, that's not going to happen. So if you want to know, average in terms of Canadian women who have 3 or more children is about 10%. So we're a long ways off from there. Okay. Okay, it's only 5 questions. It looks much worse than this. Okay. Oh my God. Even okay, no, I answered this question by not answering it. Okay. Everyone gets married nowadays. Nobody gets married nowadays. That's the problem. Nobody gets married nowadays. Like, honestly, the percentage of people getting married is dropping like a stone. So almost nobody gets married nowadays. It's always been this weird kind of institution that's both state and religious, right? Anyway, I could go back to the Roman Empire and tell you about the history of marriage from the Roman Empire, but I'm not going to do that because all of this is just an aside. Polygamy, one man, multiple women. Yes. Besides Islam, which other religions allow polygamy? Certain sorts of Buddhism do. A lot of African folk religions do. There's a bunch of, some forms of Christianity do, especially in places like Africa and Asia. Yeah, there's lots of religious forms that do. When my parents got divorced, they had to talk about who kept the dog, but not where their kids go. I mean, hey, at least you know where you stand, right? You're less important than the dog. I'm sorry. That was cruel. Okay. Can I do one more slide? I got or a couple more slides. I don't want to go early. Okay. Conflict theorists, right? When we talk about conflict theorists and what they argue in terms of functionalists. Okay. So functionalists will typically argue that the nuclear family, right? Nuclear family is the most functional way to raise children, right? It gives them the best chance at being well-adjusted, emotionally, well-supported financially, and given lots and lots of opportunity. So conflict theorists will tend to argue with functionalists. The traditional nuclear family, rather than being a good system, is actually one that's profoundly based on gender inequality, which I'll talk about on the next slide. I'll talk about that in a second, because one of the kind of founders of conflict theory, which was Marx's buddy and sugar daddy in some ways, Friedrich Engels, really, really didn't like marriage. And then the changes in power relations between men and women will alter family structures, particularly lead to more single mother families. Okay, so what did Friedrich Engels say about marriage? Well, what Friedrich Engels suggests is that marriage, and here, Engels is being a little bit weird and wonky, and there's some problems with Engels' theory. But he argued that, traditional nuclear family emerged along with inequalities in wealth. Specifically, that it is a function of capitalism. Okay? I don't know why I said that with a Russian accent, or a bad Russian accent. I don't know. Okay, so capitalism creates the traditional nuclear family. And what was it there for? Well, basically, the traditional nuclear family, according to Engels, and this gets carried through into a lot of conflict theory and Marxist thought. That basically, so, I mean, for instance, I got to slow down. When you get into conflict schools of feminism, for example, this is sort of an unchallenged assumption in conflict schools of feminism that basically the nuclear family is about two things: controlling women sexually, and especially limiting female sexuality, right? Bounding it into an institutional setting where it's not free to express itself however it wants, and ensuring that a man's property would be transmitted to his offspring, particularly his male offspring, right? Okay, so like a lot of things in kind of early Marxist thought, the solution to this was the elimination of private property. And I mean, this is, again, weirdly in sort of historical terms, this is borne out in really, really odd and interesting ways. If you look at the kind of early history of the USSR, right, the Soviet Union, the first kind of officially communist state on Earth, they were very hostile to marriage initially, right? They were, they really wanted to discourage people from getting married. They promoted a very free sexuality in the early days of the Soviet Union, which only stopped, when you got Stalin. When Stalin came in, he was like, yeah, actually, I like the nuclear family quite a bit, and wanted to promote people having lots of children because, that made lots of workers and lots of soldiers, and that's what Stalin wanted. But that's neither here nor there. And it was kind of a disaster, right? Um, Breaking apart marriage left all sorts of problems in early Soviet society that took decades to resolve later on. So, they abolished private property, kind of made relationships much more contingent. At one point, they didn't list paternity on birth certificates, and it made for all sorts of weird kind of problems, especially fathers not, being there to economically support their kids. Okay, so weird history of communist gender theory notwithstanding. Okay, gender inequalities, however, one of the things that's probably problematic about Engels is gender inequalities exist in non-capitalist societies. If anything, gender inequalities are actually more the norm historically than anything else, right? And certainly if you go back to the Roman Empire, women were very much treated as chattel property. Like they were owned by their husbands or their fathers. So gender inequality has existed for a long time. And patriarchy, right, the system where men hold a lot of the power, is deeply rooted historically in things like economics, but especially in the military and cultural history of humankind. So feminists, especially from that conflict school, will say we need, a genuine gender revolution to alter this state of affairs, to undermine the very foundations of patriarchy that are built deep into that are built deeply into the human condition in lots of ways. So they here it's a call for a revolution in human nature. And I think I'll end with that. We'll pick up on families on Tuesday. Revolution in human nature. Maybe they need a Homo Sovieticus or some such thing. Okay, we'll leave it there. I don't know if there's no questions. Perfect. So why don't we leave it there? We'll come back on Tuesday of next week. Have a great weekend. We will see you later. And now I can take this accursed headphone out of my ear. Okay.